We had no idea that we were creating a phenomenon that would be around this long.
In the early 80s in Japan, there were several companies that made transforming type products. Some were vehicles to humanoids, some were vehicles to vehicles, and various things like that.
Transformers had been tested, introduced in the United States under the name Diachron, and a total failure.
And they were a lot of sort of dissimilar products, one of a kind, sort of disconnected products.
The announcer just stood behind a table that had these products on it that had been created by the Japanese, and just said, this is a robot and it can turn into this and this is a thing. And they didn't create any good versus evil or anything like that. He just showed what could be done.
But it wasn't until really Hasbro found out about this kind of toy phenomenon in Japan and thought that there was a really great idea in there if we could just wrap a story around it and bring personality to these great toys at the time.
And once they got here, they had no fantasy, no character names, no good versus evil, no home planet, any of that. So what the executives and advertising team did here was create that story.
The Transformers, more than meets the eye. Autobots wage their battle to destroy the evil.
So we literally left the first meeting with a box of some samples with a long list of the products that was going to be the line, and there were cars, and there were airplanes.
And we started talking about the line. At the end of our trip from Rhode Island to New York City, we knew what we wanted to do, and we all were in agreement about that, because kids like cars, kids like cars. Okay, the cars will be the good guys. Planes, they're not too sure about planes. How many plane trips do little kids take, especially in those days, right? Okay, they're not too sure about, good, those will be the bad guys. Guns are not good. That'll be the head bad guy.
The storyline really does need to make it really clear who's the good guy, who's the bad guy. And because they were changing so rapidly and they each had two modes, and it became visually distinct to be able to set them aside as Decepticons fly, Autobots are on the ground. And that was how we thought the kid could really keep track of who was who.
And so that was really how we divided up the line, and then we knew where we were going with it, and there was a question of naming it and focusing it.
Mostly what we were doing was creating the color language for the teams. Also, faces needed to look different on some of the products for the US than they did for Japan, so primarily those were the kinds of changes to bring them in line with the storyline that we had created.
My son Jay Bacall was the one who named it the Transformers, and we really liked that a lot. And then the group at the agency also came up with Decepticons for the bad guys and Autobots for the good guys. When we presented the Transformers name, the marketing people at Hasbro liked it a lot. They thought that was really terrific and unique. But Stephen Hassenfeld was concerned about it. And what he was concerned about it is that kids might think, and their parents might think, that it was a toy that had to be plugged into the wall. And we said, no. Really, it's going to be what we tell them it is. It's going to be something that is able to change from one shape, transform from one shape to another shape. So in a sense that was what it would be, and that's what the Transformers word would mean.
At that time, we worked with our comic book partner to create the story and the characters.
I was an editor at this comic book company. Jim Shooter, my boss, editor-in-chief, had developed a treatment that got approved by Hasbro. Civil war rages on the planet Cybertron. Destruction is catastrophic and widespread, and yet no life is lost. None, at least in the sense that we know life. For the inhabitants of Cybertron are all machines. Anyway, and this 8-page treatment is the basis of everything that became the Transformers from then on. But he wanted further development on the characters, their names, their profiles. There was probably about 24 characters that were in the initial toy line that Hasbro wanted developed. I took these, I think I was given the actual toys, the actual Japanese imports at the time, and knew what they did and knew who were the bad guy Decepticons, who were the good guy Autobots. And I would just play word games in my head, do word associations. If somebody turns into a particular kind of creature or vehicle, what words are connected to to those objects or those animals that I can use. This is like the Dead Sea Scrolls here. This is a sheet of paper I used to carry around with me all the time, jotting names down. And probably there's 300 names on this one sheet of paper, many of which became Transformers. These are the actual profiles that I hand wrote back in the 80s that turned into the character profiles that went on the packaging that were used in the comics, et cetera, et cetera. And this one that I'm holding up right here, this is Megatron. I have Decepticon gun, codename Megatron, function Decepticon leader, and then profile. Love, compassion, mercy are words that have no meaning for Megatron. He has risen to the leadership of the Decepticons by a combination of brute strength, military cunning, ruthlessness, and terror. I would submit these to Hasbro. They would look at them. We went back and forth on a couple things. I had to come up with a couple of different names here and there, but that's how it worked.
And then we came up with the idea that because it's from one shape to another shape, that we needed a driving line that would capture that. And we came up with a line, more than meets the eye, because you think it's a robot, but it's really a car. You think it's a robot, it's really a plane, or a weapon, or it's a dinosaur that turns into a robot.
Once they really started creating the overall story itself, that's what really drove a lot of the interest, I think, for kids, is that kids really identified with the characters in the story that were in there. And what was great about the toys is that it really brought the fantasy to life in a very tangible way.
Well, at the time, these products were somewhat new to us. I mean, I knew they existed. I wasn't really that hands-on with them because they were sold in Japan, not in the U.S. So we knew as soon as we got our hands on them, we knew they were really distinctively different products. I mean, in terms of the worlds of action figures, where storyline is very important, Transformers has storyline. It also actually has elaborate product feature in terms of its manipulation and changing from a robot to a car or to a jet. So we knew the product itself was really different and brought this whole layer of play beyond storyline that a lot of other action figures didn't do.
Transformers at its core is a very unique puzzle play. There's something very compelling about that to a certain type of person.
That was really, other than the aesthetics, what the product itself brought as unique. And I do think kids did feel they were puzzles. There was something the kid could do and the parent couldn't necessarily do.
Probably the average age of the Transformers buyer was like 10 years old. But if you go down about 3 or 4 years, 4-year-olds had mastered it. It's like kid mastery. They learned from their older brothers, how to do it.
Even only a small group of people here, say in presentation, could go in there with a Transformer and present it, because unless you sort of lived it, you did it a bunch of times, you didn't know how to transform those.
The Transformers, more than meets the eye. The Transformers.
What Transformers does and did, I think, is to let a child take this mystery of robots and machines and mechanics and mechanical processes and all that, put it in their hands, control it, change it, manage it, demonstrate their superiority to adults who they're listening to all day long, whether it's in school or at home, and they're the masters, they're responsible.
The toy was, in my opinion, one of the first times that you really were able to play out the fantasy in a very direct way. And the toys really brought that to life, probably better than almost any other toy could bring to life its fantasy.
I mean, you could play with it as a vehicle, play with it as a robot. On the land, they fly around, they kind of go anywhere.
So in a sense, the product itself brings something that no other toy product had ever brought to the fore, which is this ability to have this incredible involvement with the toy product itself, and then use your imagination to just let it soar when you're playing with it.
We didn't change them mechanically. In fact, the first year or two, I don't know that we would have been capable of it. We didn't have a really good in-depth understanding of being able to design something that intricate or be able to, come out with a convincing car that could actually change into a convincing robot. Takara was expert at that. Decepticons, from the very beginning, looked a certain way. Autobots looked a certain way. Some of the products we were working with was easy to make them fit. Some were a little more difficult. It did get beyond changing colors. There was a point at which we needed to start affecting the product design itself. the shape of the engines on the jet, and when they turned into the robot, making them look a little different than they did, just so that the line would hang together. Because, as I said, coming from Japan, a lot of these were dissimilar products. They didn't necessarily look like they all belonged together. So that was okay. There were so many of them at the beginning that we could find ones that looked right together. But as you started using these products and needing more, you started picking either fringe or dissimilar things, and they started over the years needing more and more and more modification, to the point where we really began working with Takara collaboratively, where we would actually say, look, we really need a car like this. We'd love it to turn into a robot like this. Can you design that? And it was Takara's challenge, which they rose to make that actually happen in real life physically.
It's really fun to, as a designer, the challenge of creating a toy that has that much play to it. You have two different modes, the robot and the vehicle, figuring out how those things work together.
You sort of had to have an innate understanding of where things are going. Where do the wings go when you transform this into a robot? Where does the hood go? How does he not look like he's got this big hood as part of his chest? Because that won't be cool. You want it to look a little more technical than that. There were only kind of a few people who could have a gut feel for that. And certainly every designer at Takara had that gut feel, but there are only a few people on this side. So in terms of actually product aesthetics, it was driven by probably design more than any other team in terms of understanding what you could and couldn't do in the transformation.
Every one is a new challenge, which is my favorite thing about the brand.
Coming off of the success that we had with bringing G.I. Joe, reinventing that into a new cartoon and a new comic book line, we took the same strategy on Transformers.
We were not the first one to come to market. GoBots was the first one to come to market, and they came to market in California in a test market situation. Once we knew that, we said, let's go out there with the comic book. Let's go out there with the comic book, advertising the comic book with some really hot animation and the song.
Transformers, more than meets the eye. The Transformers.
And we did that, and the kids knew. It's like, it's their culture, right? They knew, oh, okay, this is like G.I. Joe. That must mean that the toys are going to be coming out soon.
There were phone calls at Hasbro asking for where are the Transformer toys, even though in the comic advertising there was no mention of Hasbro at all. No logo, nothing, no mention, and yet kids are smart. They knew who to call to ask, when is this coming?
There were very tight laws in place for TV shows that are associated with products that were intended for kids. And at some point in the early 80s, some of those regulations were loosened.
And that led to the opportunity that you could have a tie-in, a show directly to product. And then that led to a bigger idea of, well, where do kids spend their time? And in the early 80s, comic books were big. And that really resonated because kids saw it everywhere they went, whether it was in the toy store, the comic book store, or on TV.
So it was the change in those regulations that really allowed the kids to see how these great stories could be played out with their toys in a much more meaningful way.
Hello again, Megatron.
What the cartoon and animation did was give them life, a life beyond what the physical toy could do. And that really resonated. And I think they fed off of each other. I think then once the toys started coming into the programming over the course of the seasons, people looked forward to either buying the toy of a character they saw or couldn't wait to see the toy they have in the cartoon.
Because the TV show, pretty much it's always seen more viewership than what you're going to get out of a comic book. The show really allowed us to kind of tell the general story of the Transformers and get to know some of the characters. The comic books historically have always allowed us to dig a little bit deeper and play with a little bit different storylines, not only as far as what's happening within Autobots versus Decepticons, but also dig a little bit deeper in each of the personalities. So I think what's happened over time is that our comic book series have always allowed our most passionate fans to really find out one or two levels deeper into the magic of what's happening in this story, whereas our TV animation has really been able to tell the general story and introduce our characters in all new ways, in a way that's very entertaining for the broadest audience possible.
I don't know who you are, but you saved our lives. We're Autobots.
We're from Cybertron, a planet far from Earth.
Another planet? That's awesome!
Those who tried to harm you are called Decepticons. We must stop them before they destroy your world.
I think cartoons at the time, you know, certainly had their rules and violence issues and things, so it was a toned down version, whereas a comic book, I think the writers had the ability to explore the deeper myths and deeper character traits, which could be more aggressive than you could ever see on a half-hour animated program at that time. I think it's safe to say that when Transformers came out, it was a smash. I don't think anyone was prepared for how that puzzle play from vehicle to robot would resonate. And in an effort to get that entertainment out, whether it be in print or animation, they didn't always match up.
Shockwave! What is your command, Megatron?
You are to stay behind. I entrust Cybertron to you, Shockwave.
There were some disconnects because the lines of communication were running so fast that you know, the different parties that were responsible for telling those stories or bios or what have you didn't have time to talk to each other. We do a much better job now, but back then that caused a lot of the inconsistencies that still resonate with the fans today, where characters are represented differently across the different mediums.
I think one of the things that has allowed Transformers to stay relevant since 1984 is its ability to continuously evolve.
I think everything that's been done over the last 25 years, we try to bring that to bear when we're developing new ideas, new concepts, but always with an eye to the past, as if that's the signpost that we should head toward and whenever we create anything new.
We continue to create new and exciting stories and reveal new characters and new storylines, each with a really powerful emotional connection to our fan base.
I'm as excited as anyone to see where it goes next.
We shall rise again.
This has been the most fun job I've ever had, whether at Hasbro or anywhere else, is really being associated with Transformers. I've been lucky enough to kind of be one of the people on the team to see how Transformers, the brand, has really changed over the past 5 or 6 years to this global phenomenon now.
It's really fun seeing kids today playing with them, seeing a kid in the airport carrying his Transformer with him or pretending to be Optimus while he makes his brother pretend to be Megatron. It's really satisfying to see that you're having that kind of impact on a kid today.
What was great about working on the Transformers was it was this unformed world. I had no restrictions. I could come up with mythologies. I could come up with what their home planet looked like. I could come up with a concept like the creation matrix and explain how new Transformers are created that way. And nobody was there to stop me because there was nothing out there to say otherwise, really. And it made it a wonderful opportunity to really let my imagination run free.
It was amazing to be able to be there from the very beginning, to be able to impact in a team way with the Hasbro and with our writers and with the artists and with the production company, and have all this experience happen in a situation where everybody was only concerned with making it as good as possible.
There's been a lot of people that have made it what it is at this point. And I try to do our best to keep it going and play off that heritage that they initiated so that we keep going year over year.
You know when you're doing a good quality product, you know when the story is rich, you know when it feels right. But again, you have no conception whatsoever that, 30, 35 years later, that these toys and this story and this intellectual property will be sort of treasured the way it is.
I always loved the Shockwave character, both in the animation and because my brother had the toy when I was a kid and he'd get mad when I tried to play with it.
I did have a favorite in the 80s, and that was the Perceptor toy, which he didn't see a lot of time in the comics or cartoons because he was a microscope and people didn't know what to do with the gear-based Transformers.
Grimlock getting angry now. He was he was so great. He had this gigantic guy. It was like Andre the Giant was a Transformer.
One of my favorite characters also was the Sharktacon.
I always liked Soundwave, but there was just something really cool about Soundwave. He had such an iconic voice.
We have been detected.
Robots in disguise.